And the idea of the procurement came up, and it's developed over time to now we've developed some pretty solid position on this, and we've networked with our IFIs across the country, and this 5% target of government contracts going to Indigenous suppliers makes sense. I do wonder about the challenges of making that happen, and some of the things that we have to do on our side, some of the things you'd have to do on your side, and how we could better get to that place that we want to be. And certainly identifying who are Indigenous entrepreneurs and what that means and how we'd go about doing that and how we'd come up with some certification or questions we've all asked. Interesting, when we started this process, we even had to go inside ourselves as what qualified as an Indigenous business and had our own internal back and forth about what that possibly could mean. So it's been a learning process. Ultimately, at the end of the day, our entrepreneurs just want to do business, and if given the opportunity, they'd do it well. I believe that. And so how do we go about creating that? What I've always found is that we've got this side A and side B, and there's this in the middle that we've got to create that space there so that they link up better. And if we can do that, and however that might be, I think that's where we'll flourish. I can't help but think also about the procurements that are available First Nations vis-a-vis industry directly. That's where we seem to have had the most progress. And I've been to those offices right in First Nations communities where their procurement office is interfacing with industry directly, and lots of activities coming from it. I think we could learn from them about how they do it and how we can imitate some of those things. And quite frankly, a lot of it's about relationship. We're very good on relationship. We know once we start that, we'll do it. An industry knocks on the door and says, I need this piece of equipment. I need this skilled labor right away. Do you have it? Yeah, we've got it. What do you need? So I think we need to look at that and start seeing how we might be able to imitate that for government procurement. Thank you.
Merci pour cette réponse effectivement concrète et à travers.
Thank you for that very clear answer. You pointed out that it is very important to recognize Indigenous or First Nations organizations. In Quebec, there is ID1N.org, which allows First Nations communities or organizations to certify themselves. And this allows them to operate outside of the federal government's jurisdiction. And we do know that under the federal jurisdiction, a lot can happen. For example, the ArriveCan scandal. But when the federal government gives out contracts, it's not. We know that they might not actually be Indigenous organizations. How do we make sure that we are certifying properly Indigenous organizations?
Merci. I think, quite honestly, bluntly, respectfully, we know best who's Indigenous and who's not. We do. And so if you give us the framework on to create that, we will. Like I said, we've already started that process, and we've already started creating some goalposts. And if we were given the mandate to solidify those goalposts so that we know that when they're going over, that this will be there, that we will create those. And I believe that once we've been given that mandate, we will create them. Thank you.
Miigwech.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Maire. I have the unfortunate news to share that we weren't able to get Grand Chief's sound figured out. So I think as long as it's the will of the committee, we'll be able to invite him back and provide the testimony that he was able just to begin today. But we are very fortunate. We have two fantastic witnesses here today to direct your questions to. And with that, I'll turn the floor over to Ms. Idlout for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And I thank you, panel, for coming here. What you have to say is very important, and it is good to hear. My first question is pertaining to the economic reconciliation by Indigenous Services Canada, because it states here that they intend to work with Indigenous partners. No, please explain your participation if any, in the development of the economic reconciliation framework? If and to bring forward an economic reconciliation framework which will remove barriers and support Indigenous visions for economic prosperity. Can you explain your participation, if any, in the development of the economic reconciliation framework? And I didn't get the order of the men she wanted, but go ahead.
Thank you for the question. We and a number of other Indigenous organizations have been gathering and discussing economic reconciliation, and we're part of a group along with NACA that created the National Indigenous Economic Strategy, and that with its 115 calls to economic reconciliation. And so we've been very active and involved with respect to what that pathway looks like. As well, we gathered last month in Winnipeg with a number of other First Nations organizations, national First Nations organizations, to talk about what economic reconciliation means and needs, and we will be providing a report on that to government here hopefully this summer, early fall, with our findings of that.
Yes, thank you. I was just thinking about all the different experiences I've had where this issue has come up and how we've muddled through it, if you will, because it's a new topic, it's a new idea in the last decade or so. But certainly at the NACA level, I was the former chair of NACA, by the way, and when I sat at that table, we were interfacing with government on various projects and various issues, and started coming up, well, what does this mean? So we had our own internal thing that we'd have to communicate back and forth. And I've actually, in another life that I'm doing right now, is teaching courses on economic development with First Nations institutes. And one of the questions that are coming up at that level is, what is economic reconciliation? One of the questions I ask my students is, what is it to you? Here's some of the stuff that's coming up. And what I've learned is it means different things to different people. And we need to honor that it means different things to different people. But also in another life I've worked directly with First Nations in interfacing with industry on getting reasonably sizable projects off the ground with First Nations partnership. And we have to educate each other about what is going on and how it's impacting the First Nation from their perspective. And it takes time. That I've sat with industry and they're saying, why would we want to sign an agreement with, it says that we will not abrogate Indigenous rights? And we're going, well, that's kind of standard, but they don't know that. And so we have to educate each other about what we want. What I've noticed that, generally speaking, for us, we don't have time constraints. Generations isn't a big issue for us on a project. We're thinking long term. We're not here to buy this and turn it over and flip it in 10 years. We're thinking long term. I mean, 99-year leases don't mean much to us because we know we're going to be here in 99 years. And their mindset, I think we just have to start getting into that, is they operate at the speed of business. Time is much different. And so how we can understand each other and get business done, I think, is a learning process, but it's a good thing. And the more we learn from each other, the more we adapt with each other, and the more benefit, I think, can come from both of us. Thank you.
Okay.
You have about 45 seconds left.
Okay, I'll switch to. Are we having a second round?
Yes, there'll be a second round.
All right.
Okay.
I'll
Thank
finish
you.
for now. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlout. With that, we will move to the second round. Going up first, we have Ms. Rood for 5 minutes, and the floor is yours.
Thank Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for being here today. Mr. Leach, you've talked a lot about economic reconciliation, and I have the pleasure of representing 5 different First Nations in my Southern Ontario riding, and that is a topic of discussion that's come up quite often in my meetings with the chiefs, especially of late. But they've told me that they want to be prosperous, they're seeking investments in their communities, but they find that they're being stonewalled right now by the current NDP Liberal government at every turn. And one of their largest concerns is the lack of meaningful consultations. They feel that they're not being listened to. So in your experience, how has the lack of government consultation hampered reconciliation efforts? And do you see First Nations as being given a lower priority by this current government?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've wondered about this for a while. I'm in a unique place. We're in a unique place in British Columbia. I was just watching the news last night. The city of Vancouver has actually put a action plan together for UNDRIP. They supported and passed a law on it a long time ago. And the provincial government has done a similar thing. I've talked to my Indigenous friends across the country, and they're saying, you guys did that? Your governments are doing that? And I'm going, yeah, of course, that's what we've done. And so I'm thinking, gee, is there something there that is there? And it just makes good sense that we create an open climate under reconciliation, under what is reconciliation? To me, it's looking at something from a different perspective, saying, I should keep my mind open that the way they're viewing this might be different than the way that I'm viewing it. And let me try to understand what you're saying so that we can work together to come up with an outcome that's good for both of us. To me, that's the gist of what reconciliation is. And in that vein, I think that there are areas where we could still continue to learn from each other so that we go, okay, I get it now. That's what you're saying. Let's work on that. I just feel we've been lucky back over there. We're not struggling with that. We're not struggling with governments as much to say, let's do business. And in my trading area, I got 50-plus First Nations. In the Coast Salish territory, there are 50. And many of them are doing quite well, frankly. And they just go to the table saying, this is our situation. Let's get together, work. I don't think we have as much resistance on our side. I think we've got a lot of entrepreneurship there to do some good stuff. And it's just made for a good climate. It doesn't hurt that the property values are going through the roof over there, by the way. So that's made some good business opportunities for us as well. So I think we've almost had a perfect storm. But I'd like to think that we could model some of those things in other areas. And I think it starts by just being open to trying to understand what the other side is saying and to work with that in a good, respectful way. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Now, you mentioned earlier about industry being in the backyards of many First Nations, especially forestry, and you mentioned carbon tax. And so I'm just wondering, knowing that many First Nations are rural and remote areas, they don't have the ability to have roadways in, they use ATVs, snowmobiles, and they don't have traditional vehicles. What is the impact of the carbon tax on these communities as far as you mentioned food cost as well and development in those areas?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. What was the impact of which taxes?
Of the carbon tax, because you mentioned the carbon tax earlier and how it would affect the communities with industry in the backyards and natural resource development.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I was only commenting on the questions that were raised in the motion. And frankly, I had to take a step back and go, what impact would this be having? And I was just using a hypothetical that it does appear that those are in our backyards, that we are greatly affected by it, and that having us to be more active recipients of that just would make sense. How we go about that, I didn't know what direct impact that would have. I would not be able to know. I don't have enough data to say one thing strongly on that one way or the other.
Okay. And just very quickly, just continuing on the first point with economic reconciliation, we have multiple EV battery plants that have been coming up around the country. And again, my First Nations have told me that they have not received consultation or inclusion of proper consultation with First Nations. So would you say that the inclusion of the First Nations in these discussions would have been a measure of economic reconciliation?
Yeah, and I think especially if they're raising it, right? I'd go back to me asking what was the process for communications. I just need to be careful. I have been working in some communities where communications has been sent, but it hasn't been followed up on. So I'd like to see what communications was done. But if it was a gap, then you just let's say, okay, sorry, oops, and then let's get people involved as early as possible. I do know that the earlier we're involved, the better results you're going to get.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rood, and I forgot to say welcome to INAN Committee. A pleasure to have you today. But with that, we're going to move on to our second questioner in the second round, Mr. Carr, for 5 minutes. Oh, it's Mark. Okay, sorry, Mr. Pulowski for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thanks. Mr. Leach, you talked about communities which had opted into the First Nations Land Management Act early and been aggressive, had prospered because of it. I wondered, and that was in response to a question about how those communities had benefited. I wonder if you're able to kind of relate that to the tax angle, because obviously we're talking here about tax. I understand under First Nations Land Management Act, there are some provisions on related to real property tax, I guess. But now maybe you don't want to divulge what could be maybe you consider confidential information as to which communities, but those that have actually prospered from taxing either under the First Nations Land Management Act or under the First Nations Goods and Services Tax or the First Nations Sales Tax. All of those are kind of opportunities to make money, and maybe once you do, Mr. Foss could also maybe.
Okay, yeah, I can say this generally speaking, that if you think about it, I am in the Coast Salish territory. Property values are very high there. That if a First Nation wanted to build a bunch of homes and sell them on 99-year leases and collect the taxes from those every year, property taxes, they could set up a pretty nice little system there, and they have. And those that have done that, I've seen. Again, thank you for the confidentiality qualifier, because I do feel obligated, that they would have set up infrastructures where I find the taxpayers are less griping than the neighboring municipalities' taxpayers, which goes, what's going on here? They're not griping as much? What's up with that? So to me, there's something there that should be further explored about if there's any concern about us taking over specific tax regimes and that it's going to fall. I think there's data out there that could be generated that says otherwise. Okay. Now, with respect to the Land Management Act, I guess all I was saying is that there is definitely a link that once they go through that process, they're creating an environment that now says, let's get tax infrastructure in place so that we can collect on that. And I think you've seen those who've done those two have done quite well in Coast Salish territory for sure.
Before I ask Mr. Foss the same question, my understanding under the Indian Act, there is some ability to collect taxes on real property, or are the ones that have benefited all been under the First Nations Land Management Act? Do they have to opt in before they can benefit from that?
It's been those that have opted in, 100%. The word on us is this: if we use the Indian Act to get any of these things, we're buried. So it's only on the new systems that these things have done better.
Mr. Foss, maybe again, and maybe you don't have to actually name the communities, but give some examples of communities that benefited from using their tax revenue to better the communities.
Sorry, I don't have examples for you.
Maybe back to Mr. Leach. My understanding is that there are 14 communities, and this was news to me. It was one of my assistants told me this. Under Aboriginal self-government agreements that have imposed some sort of personal income tax. I hadn't heard this before. Can you tell me about those communities' experience? Has this been financially beneficial to the communities, or is it really pissed off a lot of taxpayers?
Good question. Good question.
Or both?
Yeah, good question. It's interesting how the First Nations who've had to vote each member to support or approve this knew very well when they were, because there was lots of consultation, that this is one of the things that would come from it. and they're not happy now. I know some of the communities that they've gone through this, but then there are leadership who largely say this was a good thing. The pros outweigh the cons. So I guess it depends on who you talk to there. But there have been those who have gone through the self-government path, and generally speaking, there's a positiveness amongst the leadership, but I know though the members, when you talk to them, they're not so happy. So I guess it depends on who you talk to.
Do I have any time left?
About 40 seconds.
Big thing in Thunder Bay and a lot of communities, going to First Nations to buy your gas. There must be a trade-off in terms of taxing gas. The reason people go there is because it's cheaper because of tax advantage. You start imposing a tax and perhaps you lose that advantage. I would imagine there's a sweet spot in terms of taxing that revenue. I wonder, and Mr. Foss, if you have any ideas, but otherwise, Mr. Leach again.
Well, clearly there will be a sweet spot associated with that, but I think it's up to those communities to figure that out as they work through in practice how that balances out.
Yeah, there's definitely a sweet spot. If you go to some communities in my area, there will be some who just won't use their First Nations, and they won't use the gas station because of the tax amount. I'm thinking, you're saving anyway. Why don't you just use it? I mean, you're saving, but they won't because of the amount. And then they have these different ones. Members get this kind of discount, non-members get this kind of discount. So there are all these little things that come up. So there's definitely a sweet spot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pawlowski. Avec ça, on va aller.
With that, we will now move on to Mr. Lemire for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Leach. You probably participated in the roundtable on economic reconciliation last February. Many actors were around the table. What do you think about the direction that the federal government wants to take with regards to economic reconciliation? Do the land stewards feel like their point of view is taken into consideration?
Yeah, I mean this with the utmost respect to all governments, but it's an education process for anybody that we're working with. That we interface with old ideas, old way of doing things, and we just have to, quite frankly, educate what this means for us. And again, like I said, we have to learn too. And to me, the economic reconciliation has been a new idea for us. A lot of stuff has gone on with us where we're trying to get out of a way of thinking. Fortunately, we've had good leaders who've got us to this place that said this is kind of what ballpark it means, and we've been able to build off of it. And so I think there's a continued dialogue that we're going to have with all governments over the next generation, and hopefully we'll continue to refine this and affirm it, and we'll learn from each other and ultimately get to the sweet spot that said this is the best place what works for both of us. And so let's work in that climate to be able to do good things. And I know there's that spot that we can do that. But it's a work in progress right now.
Comment interprétez-vous la question du...
How do you see the issue of consent, and do you think that this should be improved upon?
Sorry about the question. I just missed it. What about consent?
It's about prior and informed consent of the First Nations. Would you like to improve that notion?
Absolutely. It's a key part of reconciliation. Quite frankly, for me, this is about respect. That if you want to get consensus and to build relationship, you get people involved as early as possible. And if things are happening and then moving very fast, next thing you know, oh, by the way, what do you guys think? It will fall on its face because we feel disrespected when it's happened. And I can name many, many projects, multi-billion-dollar projects that have fallen because they have not understood and followed that principle. So definitely free and prior and informed consent is an important component of that.
Merci, Miigwech.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le...
Thank you, Mr. Lemire.
To our last questioner here before we wrap this panel. Ms. Sidlow, you have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. My next question is Matthew. You may respond first, and Alex, you will respond after. In your view, what should an economic reconciliation framework entail or include? How would an economic reconciliation framework address challenges such as access to capital which affect economic development in First Nations communities?
The most fundamental business supports and the ability to help communities develop entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial skills and literacy, business literacy attached to that. The ability to have control over our land decisions, the ability to add land into reserves, and streamlining the process attached to that. I think would be a number of the primary considerations.
Thank you for the question. Quite honestly, I live and breathe this stuff every day, and I think about it every day. And I think about my grandparents who were very close to me growing up, what they were hoping and wanting. And I see it here. This is what they were hoping and wanting. The fact that I'm here at this table with you is just really amazing. And if they were here, they would be just in awe that this is where we're at. And what we have on the table, I believe, is a good start. And it is a relatively new concept. These are not concepts that they were sharing with me in that kind of language, but the ballpark is there about what they were wanting. And that was that we have a rightful place in Canada, that is with, more than anything, with respect. That the respect that we have with each other is paramount, and that we'll work together to find a solution that's good for all of us. To me, this is what this is about. And I think if we go back to our grandparents and say, what is it that they were wanting, it would be in that ballpark. But again, it's still a work in progress kind of thing. The one qualifying thing that stands out for me, frankly, is closing the gap. I want to close the gap. We've got to close the gap. And all the solutions that have been done to date have not done so well on closing the gap. Only in the last couple of decades have we been starting to make some good headway on that, but we're still a far ways away. And we've got to keep doing this work until we get some numbers that are comparable to mainstream. And First Nations, Indigenous people across the country are still far behind in many, many different numbers. Let's start working to close the gap. So respect, remembering what we were taught, and closing the gap. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sidlout. And that concludes our panel here. I do want to especially thank our witnesses for being here and for their wise testimony for our study. And with that, we will suspend very briefly before we move into committee business.